Right. Everyone, I'm Jamila Hamami. I am a member of the Open Borders Conference Steering Committee and your MC today. I want to welcome Karma Chavez. Karma teaches rights and currently serves as chair in the Department of Mexican-American and Latinos, Latina and Latino, sorry, or Latinx studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Not from Texas, yes, I am. Where she also holds several affiliate faculty appointments. She does a great deal of work. I could read the entire bio, but I'm also going to share it with you all. But one of the very exciting things is that she recently wrote an incredible book called The Borders of AIDS, Race, Quarantine, and Resistance from U of Washington Press. So I want to give it away to Karma. So thank you so much, Karma, and we look forward to hearing your incredible talk.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. It's been wonderful to listen to the conversations so far. I really want to thank the Open Borders Committee, Conference Planning Committee, and also especially want to thank you, Jamila, for really encouraging me to do this talk today. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some of the central arguments in my book, which, as they mentioned, came out in June from the University of Washington Press, and it's called The Borders of AIDS, Race, Quarantine, and Resistance. So a person wearing a Ronald Reagan mask, black suit, and long yellow rubber gloves sat casually with his ankles crossed on top of the cab of a beat-up pickup truck driving through the streets of New York. Guards in army green uniforms flanked the truck, donning the same gloves and what looked like N95 masks. The truck pulled a makeshift concentration camp, constructed of bars and razor wire. A watchtower protruded from the center of the camp, with yellow images of Reagan's face on all four sides, peering out like Big Brother. A multiracial group of prisoners looked out to the street from between the bars and barbed wire as other marchers walked slowly beside them, carrying signs proclaiming silence equals death. This prescient performative protest at the 1987 Pride March was the brainchild of the nascent AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP New York, which wanted to make a powerful statement about AIDS at the annual event. Whether ACT UP members were aware is unclear, but just weeks before the Pride March, the US Senate passed a ban on HIV-positive migrants, preventing them from coming to or legalizing within the United States. Some 4 years later, the reality that the float foreshadowed would come into existence as the United States constructed a quarantine camp for intercepted HIV-positive Haitians who fled political violence after the overthrow of their president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. Although ACT UP could not have known that they were actually predicting a future for some HIV-positive people, the ominous float made a statement about the severity of the situation for people living with AIDS, not just because of that opportunistic infections could be deadly, but for the ways that the US government would use the disease as an opportunity to alienize already maligned people like Haitians and homosexuals. In a nation state like the United States, which is founded on the creation and maintenance of a populace, a citizenry that is definitionally expulsive, exterminative, and exclusionary, whether by genocide, lynching, the plantation, the reservation, the ghetto, the internment camp, the prison, the hospital, quarantine, ban, or deportation. Disease becomes one of many opportunities to express this alienizing logic. Disease has historically been an opportunity to express the state's alienizing logic when associated with particular people. In the US context, Black, migrant, queer, trans, indigenous, poor, prostitute, of color. Regardless of whether they possess US citizenship, these are alienized people, as in they are or easily can be made alien to the nation state. The border of AIDS is about two expressions of alienizing logic: quarantine, and ban, as they manifested in the early days of the AIDS pandemic in the United States from 1981 to 1993. Despite the quarantines never made much medical or epidemiological sense to address the spread of HIV and AIDS, quarantine's centrality in the public imagination is evident in wide-ranging calls for it, extensive fears of it, and its proliferation in AIDS discourse, almost from its inception. Eventually, such rhetoric materialized in state-level quarantine laws that often emerged in response to the behaviors of supposedly recalcitrant Black sex workers. Such expressed concerns about the movement of fugitive Black bodies as a narrative as old as the days of fugitive slaves in the United States. The alienizing logic refined during these frenzied calls for quarantine manifested in one way with widespread passing of laws that criminalize HIV, which has disproportionately impacted Black men. Although quarantine never became a law or set of laws applied to HIV-positive US citizens en masse, rhetorics of quarantine manifested in another way by animating the 22-year-long US ban on HIV-positive migrants, which was only lifted in 2010. My book tells a story about how public health officials, politicians, the media, and others applied alienizing logic to people living with AIDS in the form of quarantine and ban rhetorics, and how some of those most impacted fought back. To understand this story, I must first explain what I mean by alienizing logic. A logic is a structure of thinking that thereby structures expression. A logic can be expressed in innumerable ways by countless actors or entities, but who deploys a logic results in different impacts. A logic can emerge from numerous, even competing belief systems or ideologies. What I describe as an alienizing logic references a structure of thinking which insists that some are necessarily members of a community and some are recognized as not belonging, even if they physically reside there. The alien outside is not a part of a simple dichotomy constituted by a firm boundary between two easily identifiable positions. The book addresses three primary definitions of alien to show that those rendered alien are not merely foreign. An alien can refer to a person who does not belong, a person who is separated or excluded from, a person who or thing which is opposed, repugnant, or unaccustomed to. In real life, these definitions are perpetually blended together, even if in particular contexts, one understanding dominates. In each case, to be rendered alien involves a relationship between two or more entities and involves a recognition by one or more of those entities of a person as an alien. Taken together, they provide a framework to begin to understand how alienizing logic works. To only juxtapose the alien with the citizen implies thinking of the alien only in its legal register as a foreign migrant. This is a part of a divide and conquer strategy that denies a fuller meaning of alienage. The state and other entities apply alienizing logic to citizens and migrants alike. As I said before, the logic may manifest differently. Genocide, lynching, the plantation, the reservation, the ghetto, the internment camp, the prison, the hospital, quarantine, ban, or deportation. Fundamentally, those with inalienable rights have the power to alienize. Those without them do not. Like many other diseases, Brett Stockdale writes of HIV/AIDS that it has always been a problem that has severely affected those at the intersections of multiple oppressions: homophobia, racism, sexism, and classism in particular. His claim is important because while illness can technically afflict anyone, extreme health disparities exist between the structurally privileged and those who reside in the intersections of the structures of oppression. Disease can manifest because of structural oppression, and disease can become an opportunity to exacerbate structural oppressions through alienizing logic. Fundamentally, using disease or fear of disease as an opportunity to enact alienizing logic has always been racialized and usually racist. Susan L. Smith notes, for example, that in antebellum United States, many white Southerners believed that if Black people became sick, it was because of an inherently weaker constitution. At the same time that some physicians maintained that African Americans were more resistant than white people to certain diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. Either way you cut it, Black people's relationship to disease was one of the many factors white people used to alienize them. And such logics continue to the present day, where many continue to believe that supposed Black inferiority explains health disparities. Other groups also suffer. For example, Nyan Shah writes, 19th century public health officials saw the project of preserving the public health as, quote, undercut by the reputed vile and disease-breeding qualities of Chinese settlement in the city. In the name of safeguarding the health of the entire population, public health strategies of surveillance, documentation, and quarantine generated new conceptions of Chinese behavior at odds with the standards of proper social conduct. Here, the concern is not about the health of the Chinese, but how their alleged unhealthy cultural habits might leak out, impacting the good health of the general population. Not all Chinese were migrants, but some were, and public health officials often put racialized migrants at the center of concerns about disease. Howard Markle and Alexandra Minna Stern note a consistent pattern in US American history of stigmatizing migrants as the etiology of a wide variety of physical and societal ills. Such a pattern can be seen starkly in historic practices at US ports of entry, where migrants would be undressed and scrutinized for signs of malady and moral weakness, or they and their belongings deloused to prevent their diseases from penetrating the United States. From the arrival of the first ships carrying stolen Africans to the relatively present day, migrants have been quarantined to ensure their fitness to the nation. Examples are virtually endless and continue well into the 21st century. Now, my book does not minimize the fact that in the United States, most of our histories of HIV and AIDS are about white US citizen gay men, nor do I minimize that men who have sex with men continue to receive a disproportionate impact in the US from HIV and AIDS. But my book emerges from a concern shared with Michelle Tracy Berger, who emphasizes the obstacles faced by those living with HIV/AIDS who face multiple axes of oppression or intersectional stigma. The concerns of those experiencing intersectional stigma differ from those living with AIDS who hold relative privilege based on race, class, or gender. My concern extends further. How do immigration and citizenship status matter as additional sites of power and oppression that impact people's experiences with HIV and AIDS, and the ways HIV and AIDS become an opportunity to enact alienizing logic? I'll start now with a discussion of how the alienizing logic of quarantine manifested in US calls to quarantine people in the US who had HIV/AIDS. From very early days, public health and medical professionals had the information before them that unlike air or saliva-borne infections like tuberculosis, AIDS was not casually communicable. Nevertheless, the question of quarantine was prominent in debates about how to prevent the spread of AIDS throughout much of the 1980s. The loudest of these voices came from the far right, including figures such as Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority, Orange County Republican Congressman William Dannemeyer, and right-wing fringe figure Lyndon LaRouche. Yet serious considerations of quarantine filled the pages of dozens of law reviews, found their way to the editorial pages of major publications, the surveys of prominent pollsters, and the drafting tables of state public health officials and legislators. Some even suggested that the Centers for Disease Control quietly laid plans in preparation for a mass quarantine of people with AIDS. Now, it is important to remember that past quarantines in the United States most adversely affected communities imagined outside of the proper white citizenry, including sex workers and migrants. Although others might have been afflicted, and on occasion the reach extended further, the most well-known and documented quarantines in US history targeted these already dehumanized groups that lacked political, racial, and economic power. In the early years of AIDS, although calls to quarantine seemed to be about the most visibly maligned group in the US, gay men, the reality played out much differently. The rash calls to quarantine at state and local levels that manifested from the rhetorical furor around AIDS across the US manifested on the backs of Black sex workers. I'll share one story here. In 1985, the white male Texas State Health Commissioner, Robert Bernstein, put forth a quarantine proposal that would have given state or local health officials the power to confine any person with AIDS who was deemed a public health threat because they would not stop engaging in risky activities. Bernstein made this call in light of the infamous and tragic life of an alleged Black male sex worker in Houston, Fabian K. Bridges. The details of Bridges' life are contested. The gay press paints a radically different picture than the mainstream media. That the reports conflict is not surprising. It speaks to the reason why marginalized communities have always created their own media to tell stories about themselves from their own perspectives. The conflicting reports and a sensational documentary help to articulate how a quote unquote incorrigible Black gay man alleged to be a sex worker ends up at the center of the AIDS quarantine debate. According to the gay press, Bridges' story came to the attention of public health officials as the result of a Minneapolis-based news crew from WCCO-TV that came to Houston in the summer of 1985 to learn about the gay community's struggles after the defeat of an employment referendum. That story apparently did not prove to be very interesting, but producers learned about Bridges, a Black gay man with AIDS struggling with poverty and homelessness. Their recordings became a documentary, which was then aired as part of a PBS Frontline episode, AIDS, A National Inquiry in 1986. Now, before Bridges was diagnosed with AIDS, he worked a stable job paying $19,000 a year at the Harris County Flood Authority. After his diagnosis, he got sick and entered a hospital, soon losing his housing and his job. At the time the news crew arrived, Bridges was not even in Houston. After making his way to Indianapolis to try to seek help from his sister and brother-in-law, who would not take him in but affectionately called him by his middle name, Calvin, he ran into trouble with law enforcement for allegedly stealing a bicycle. Knowing he has AIDS, instead of filing charges against him, a judge and law enforcement officers purchased him a bus ticket to Cleveland, where his mother lived. The news crew went there to locate him, where they followed him as he tried to connect with his mother, whose husband would not let Bridges stay with her. Bridges struggled to find other housing since no shelters would take him. He eventually ended up in a hotel room paid for by the Red Cross as he waited for his Social Security disability payments to begin. Houston's Montrose Voice, a gay publication bearing the name of Houston's gayborhood, Montrose, reported that the news crew regularly paid Bridges for lodging and food in order to continue filming. When Bridges told them he continued to have sex, the crew reported him to Cleveland public health officials. Bridges eluded the film crew and returned to Houston, reportedly to pick up a van he owned to take back to Cleveland. Eventually, Bridges needed money, so he contacted the film crew, which then followed him to Houston. While in Houston, he visited a doctor, and the doctor told that doctor that he continued to have sex, reportedly with at least 20 people. That doctor notified the public health office. In late September, Bridges was placed under police monitoring and ordered to quit having sex. Apparently, Bridges initially said he refused the order, prompting an outcry over incorrigible AIDS victims, as well as a 2-day police hunt for Bridges, where police tried to entrap him into having sex. The tactic did not work, so they arrested him for public urination. An actual violation of his order would have been a third-degree felony, punishable by 10 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Media relished the story. On October 5th, 2 doctors who had treated Bridges at different hospitals, one of whom had urged that he be given a quarantine warning, issued a statement defending their actions with Bridges and assuring that their actions were not anti-homosexual, but pro-health. The one who had requested the original quarantine warning, a white male physician, Robert Ah, stated, "I requested that this quarantine warning be served on Mr. Bridges because he was alone, confused, and frightened, and obviously needed help. He had repeatedly refused the attempts by discharge planners, social workers, and myself to be placed in a boarding house or to contact the KS AIDS Foundation. He preferred to be an independent street person." The full text of this statement is not available, so it is impossible to contextualize the rest of their comments. But this excerpt is significant. Issued just days after a police manhunt for Bridges and the city health director's order to stop having sex, Dr. Ah suggested that his call for quarantine emerged from his humanitarian pity and concern. Because Bridges was alone and in need of assistance, Dr. Ah called for his isolation. Dr. Ah juxtaposed his rational pastoral care with Bridges' irrational desire to be independent and to remain on the street. Throughout his ordeal, Bridges ended up in Time magazine and repeatedly in Houston local media. In these depictions, as in the Frontline documentary, few even questioned whether Bridges was okay, instead insisting he was clearly demented and needed to be confined to a mental health institution. Diego Lopez, a clinical director for Gay Men's Health Crisis, and the only person of color or person living with AIDS on the Frontline experts panel, was the only one who expressed concern for Bridges, noting that the depiction of him was racist and homophobic, and that Bridges was victimized by all the systems that failed him. As Judy Woodruff, the host of the documentary, noted, the gay community began protecting Bridges from all mainstream press. On the advice of people from the gay community, including Houston's well-known white gay activist, Ray Hill, and the KS AIDS Foundation, Bridges voluntarily entered a hospital in early October, then lived with friends for a short time before dying in a hospital on November 17th, 1985, and being buried in a pauper's grave because his family had no money for a funeral. That public health officials created hysteria over the need to quarantine Bridges just 6 weeks before he died is telling. Friends and supporters reported he was 6'2", 126 pounds, and suffering from genital and rectal herpes before he died. As one put it, "I feel he could not have given it away, let alone sold it." The public affairs director at WCCO-TV, which followed Bridges for the documentary, admitted that his crew did not know whether Bridges lied about his sexual activity in order to get food and shelter from reporters. They also denied that Bridges was a prostitute. For Bridges' part, he seemed to have little sense that his story would be taken up in the exploitative way that it was. At the end of the documentary, filmmakers showed a clip of Bridges sitting in his Cleveland hotel room, wearing a black t-shirt and speaking in a soft voice. We do not know what he has been asked, but he said, "Let me go down in history as being I am somebody that'll be respected, somebody who's appreciated, and somebody who can be related to. There's a whole lot of people who just go. They're not even on the map. They just go." It might seem strange that I've spent all of this time at an Open Borders conference telling you the story of a Black gay man who was a US citizen and potentially a prostitute. However, what I am trying to do in the book is to tell a story about how fears and beliefs around racialized sexuality, and particularly how anti-Blackness, were at the root of many US responses to HIV/AIDS in the early years of the pandemic, and frankly, today. This has global implications. For example, as Jennifer Breyer suggests, while policymakers rarely spoke of race directly, images of people of color as sources of contagion suffused the public language spoken in Washington. And particularly, fears of African and Haitian migrants were infused into every aspect of AIDS discourse in the United States. This meant that for US citizens, Black folks suffered the most dire consequences of alienizing logic as it manifested in calls to quarantine. But a group that is rarely named in histories of HIV and AIDS, migrants, also endured dire consequences. In the fall of 1985, calls for quarantine and public concerns about AIDS reached a fever pitch. At the time, Acting Health and Human Services Secretary James O. Mason proposed an initial rule for the Federal Register that would change the definition of dangerous and contagious disease by adding AIDS for the purpose of immigration law. Thus, the targeting of and isolating of people living with AIDS that outside of prisons never fully flourishes in relation to US citizen communities is given shape as sound immigration policy. So a lot of people don't know that the first time that the full US Senate debated AIDS policy, it was in relation to the ban on HIV positive immigrants. A ban and a quarantine are not exactly the same practices, but they both emerge from alienizing logic. Furthermore, a ban that prevents some people from coming to the United States or regulating their status if they were already here can have similar effects as a quarantine: isolation, exclusion, and stigmatization. By 1988, the United States had more reported cases of AIDS than the entire rest of the world combined, totaling nearly 60% of known cases. Fingers pointed from the United States to Africa and Haiti as the culprits. Now, surely cases in some countries were underreported, but by the available numbers, whether HIV originated in the United States, this country was a principal breeding ground for its spread. Most of the world regarded the United States as the primary exporter of HIV/AIDS. Nevertheless, key members of the Reagan administration and the US Congress supported and advocated passing laws to exclude those with HIV/AIDS from migrating to this country. This came to a head when many of the same people, like Senator Jesse Helms or Congressman William Dannemeyer, who had long been calling for the quarantine of US citizens, living with HIV and AIDS in the US turned their attention to immigration policy. In 1987, Senator Helms proposed an amendment to a supplemental appropriations bill to add HIV and AIDS to the list of dangerous and contagious diseases for the purpose of immigration law. Now, I tell the full story of this in my book, but suffice it to say that after much debate, the Senate unanimously approved this, and Reagan signed it into law. Although both Presidents Bush and Clinton agreed to remove the provisions because virtually no one believed that it made sense from a public health perspective, the law was codified by the Senate in 1993, while hundreds of allegedly HIV-positive Haitian migrants who fled political persecution after the overthrow of Aristide were held in concentration camp conditions on Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, because discriminatory law prevented them from having their asylum cases heard on US soil. As one of the imprisoned, 28-year-old Elma Verdú put it, "One thing I have noticed since the beginning of history is that white people have been trying to create another planet where they can put us in order to separate us. I think they are trying to create that planet now, and they are starting with the Haitians." The story of the so-called Haitian connection to HIV/AIDS is a long one, part of which I also detail in the book, but it fully exemplifies the anti-Blackness inherent in the way the US used AIDS as an opportunity to enact its alienizing logic. In 1982, the Centers for Disease Control first designated those at high risk for contracting AIDS. Those groups were colloquially called the 4-H Club: homosexual men, Haitians, hemophiliacs, and heroin users. The separate designation of Haitians proved highly controversial because they were the only national group originally marked at risk. And Haiti was already maligned in the US public sphere as the supposed origin of AIDS, a claim always disputed by experts such as Paul Farmer. With the CDC designation, Haitian community and political groups, although acknowledging Haitians had been affected, denounced their singling out. Haitians in both countries felt the impact of stigmatization. Those in the United States faced rampant discrimination by employers, landlords, the media, and the general public. In Haiti, the once flourishing tourist industry was decimated by 1983. The detention of the HIV-positive Haitians on Guantanamo is one of the most repugnant and horrific implications of the HIV ban. And it was the logical outcome of the US approach to AIDS. The detained Haitians, along with Haitian groups and AIDS activist groups in the US, fought their detention. Those in Guantanamo were all politically active, and they had met the requirements for asylum, so they were well organized. In fact, while the Senate debated whether to codify the ban in February 1993, they were in the middle of a hunger strike. They constantly protested their conditions and confinement and were treated brutally by US military officials charged with their care. In late 1993, in early 1993, over 300 Marines in full riot gear descended on sleeping refugees in a military operation. Soldiers arrested 31 refugees, including a 7-year-old boy. Several women were subjected to vaginal searches. The camp itself was overrun with rats and other vermin. One advocate for the Haitians explained how the Haitians understood their plight. "If we were really sick, we would be in hospitals. We wouldn't be treated this way as prisoners. You can see they're not being treated as sick people," the woman said. "They've been assaulted. They've been harassed the whole time they've been in there. They've been thrown in jail within the jail and mistreated in several ways. And when they are sick and they bring it to the attention of the doctors, they don't get the medical attention that they need. Haitians would only finally be sent to the United States when they were on their deathbeds. For example, 26-year-old Joel Santil, a first-year medical student when he fled Haiti, died only 8 days after being released from Guantanamo. 200 rageful Haitian protesters took his body to the immigration office in Miami to vividly show how his death was the government's fault. Salisa's success had a 3-month-old son, Ricardo, who developed pneumonia on the base, which is what prompted officials to send her and her son to the Walter Reed Military Hospital in the United States. After tiny Ricardo died, authorities promptly sent Success to the Varick Street Detention Center in Manhattan, which was the regular site of protests against the Haitian imprisonment. The Haitians were only finally released in June 1993 when a judge ordered it. Upon finally being released into the United States, 22-year-old Wesner de Rossier told a Stonewall News reporter that he often wondered if he should have stayed in Haiti, even though he and his brother were involved in Aristide's presidential campaign and were no longer safe. He said that while he was incarcerated, I used to think of an old Haitian proverb: it is better to die as a tiger than as a dog. Haitians were horrifically dehumanized on Guantanamo Bay, but their freedom dreams continued. Reunited with his fiancée, de Rozier hoped, I would like to be somebody, to be a light for society. Gerard Jean Bernard, 35, shared that sentiment. More than anything else, I want to make something of myself. I want to learn something and take it back to my brothers and sisters there in Haiti and my children. I don't want my kids to go through what I went through. Even Salisa's Success continued chasing her freedom dreams. Even though I lost my mother, father, and baby, I think of what Aristide said. Together, we are strong. Consequently, she added, I still feel that I cannot be discouraged because together as Haitians, we are strong. But within a decade, more than half of those who had been imprisoned at Guantanamo were dead. I don't mean to gloss over these events here, but I encourage you to read about them in my book or in books like Naomi Pake's Rightlessness. The larger point I want to make for our purposes here is that powerful countries like the United States use disease as an opportunity to enact alienizing logic, and alienizing logic is deadly. It is incumbent upon those of us committed to open borders to take seriously the role of disease in serving as a rationale for necropolitical agendas. And even more than that, it is necessary that we take seriously how disease is always constituted through racialized sexuality. One only needs to think about our present moment. Recently, as was mentioned in the last panel, we've been inundated with harrowing images of US Border Patrol agents and Texas Rangers on horseback, rounding up Haitian asylum seekers near Del Rio, Texas, and reportedly using whips to do so. In a country founded on slavery, US officials whipping Black people should give anyone pause, but these particular Black people are being targeted by the Biden administration using the March 2020 Trump era order from the CDC, allowing the use of Title 42 of the US Code. Again, in Title 42, the federal government, and specifically the CDC, is allowed during threat of communicable disease to prohibit, in whole or in part, the introduction of persons and property from such countries or places as he shall designate in order to avert such danger, and for such period of time as he may deem necessary for such purpose. Trump and now Biden have chosen to apply this to anyone arriving from Mexico or Canada, because such people would arrive at ports of entry in ways that would introduce them to a quote, congregate setting. Trump and now Biden reasoned that such settings put migrants in a situation in which spread of COVID-19 would be imminent, even while public health officials outside of the government have repeatedly said that applying public health principles like masks, social distancing, or processing people outdoors or in spaces with good ventilation would make better public health sense than deporting people, many with a credible fear of future political persecution. Yet, in a recent interview, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas continued to defend the Biden administration, stating, "It is currently our government's intention to continue to exercise our Title 42 authority in light of the public health imperative as determined by the Centers for Disease Control." Although this current US government-induced crisis may seem outrageous to some, Title 42, which is being disproportionately used against Haitians now, is the exact same provision that led to the imprisonment of Haitians I spoke of before. Any hopes for open borders must take on directly the anti-Blackness inherent in alienizing logic in the US and globally. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that very gripping and important and eloquent talk. I know that, a lot of us who are old enough to remember that era are familiar with some of the events that you talk about, and maybe younger people don't know about that. So I think that was very excellent to bring that to our attention. So in my capacity as the Q&A moderator, I would strongly encourage the attendees to go to the bottom of their Zoom screen or wherever they can find it. There's a button that says Q&A. Please type in your questions. We'd like comments, but we'll actually focus on questions directed to Professor Chavez. And please don't be shy. This is quite an excellent scholar here that you can talk to directly. So let me take a look, and I'll give people a moment to compose a question and to please do so. Please put it in the comments. But I'll start out with a question of my own while I am waiting for people to put their questions in the chat box. So Professor Chavez, could you describe a little bit of the differences between how COVID has been used as a cudgel, as a talking point for restriction of movement, and the kind of process and historical period that your book documents? Like, what's the differences? What are some of the commonalities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There are obvious similarities. We can, of course, think about when COVID began, the way that Donald Trump talked about the China virus or the Chinese virus, and the way that the existence of the virus was used as a rationale to target people. We can also see the rush to close borders as being quite resonant. Interestingly, we can also see huge movements that occurred in the time of COVID, although COVID coincides with the murder of George Floyd, which is, of course, what compelled those movements, but COVID was a part of that too. And I think there will be a lot for historians to parse out about how different resistance might have been in the summer of 2020, if not but for the disease. I don't have a definitive statement on that, but I think it's worth noting. So there are similarities. There are many differences. One is in the diseases themselves. So COVID is actually communicable. We all know how easily it spreads. Maybe many of us in this virtual room have had it and were taking precautions and yet still got sick. HIV, of course, is spread through very particular ways. So that is one fundamental difference. Another fundamental difference, of course, is, of course, both are able to be, anybody can get sick, but it was very particular groups who were imagined to only be at risk, especially in the early several years. And so that led to even more egregious, I think, government inaction with regard to AIDS than we saw with COVID, although we saw a lot of government inaction there. So those are a few of the little things that are maybe resonant, but also different.
Great. So, okay, so questions are now coming up. Thank you very much for your comments. You can take your cursor and scroll it over the three buttons that are at the bottom of your Zoom screen and hit Q&A. So this is from a anonymous attendee. Let's see. This is a long question, so I'm just reading through it. Professor Chavez, given that Haitian refugees were detained in Cuba, and Cuba as a nation also had a very particular way of dealing with AIDS in the context of the fall of the USSR and the special period in the 1990s. Did the Cuban national approach to controlling the epidemic affect in any way how people were treated in Guantanamo?
That is an awesome question. So yeah, I mean, the Cuban government took quarantine very seriously in dealing with the spread of HIV. As far as I can tell in the archives that I consulted, that didn't have any connection to the way that the US government was treating people in Guantanamo. Of course, Guantanamo is a sort of zone, right, that is on Cuban soil, but is US controlled. And so I don't think there was any correlation there, at least nothing I was able to find in the historical record.
Okay, the next question is also anonymous. You spoke compellingly about the intersections between racism and public health restrictions. Can you speak to the role of ableism as well? And they're saying, there's a connection to eugenics and US laws that try to control people.
Yeah, I mean, this is hugely important. And it conjures what we see as the always present relationship between racism, ableism, and fears around sexuality in immigration law. And so a big part of the reason that public health provisions were put into immigration law in the 19th century absolutely had to do with questions of fitness. I put that term in quotes because obviously it was fitness was determined based on white European norms, Western European norms about who was fit to actually assimilate into the nation. And so many things, both physical and mental, were used as grounds to exclude particular diseases that were more likely to originate in locations that were not what the US immigration officials wanted in terms of bringing people to the US, right, became categories for exclusion. And historically, from 1917 to 1990, the ban on homosexuals was in law based on categories of psychopathic inferiority was the original term. And that was also profoundly ableist, but also homophobic, and also racist and anti-communist in a certain way too. And so it's very hard to parse these things away from one another. And of course, part of the way, if you look at the chapter in my book where I kind of detail some histories of quarantine, one of the things you really see is the treatment of people living with AIDS in the 80s has all the traces of eugenics logics from late 19th into the early 20th century. So it's an excellent question.
Great. And just to remind people, we have about 8-9 minutes left. So this is a great opportunity to speak to Professor Chavez directly. And while people are composing the next round of questions or they're coming through the Zoom chat system, let me ask Professor Chavez, was there any pushback from the Haitian community or the Haitian government or Haitian Americans after being so cruelly targeted in these kinds of efforts? Was there pushback?
Yeah, there was. So, when Haitians were originally designated as one of the high-risk groups, there were a number of protests that Haitian migrants, Haitian Americans in places like New York and Miami engaged in, one of which actually involved, it's hard to say the numbers, some say 50,000, some say 100,000. However many, thousands of Haitians shut down the Brooklyn Bridge for several hours in defense of, their humanity, basically. There was also a lot of resistance from particularly medical officials on Haiti, in that they didn't have the resources to address the problem there. But they were very outraged by all of the folklore, US folklore that was constituting Haiti. And so were pretty aggressive in their resistance there as well. So yes, Haitians resisted very much. It was complicated though, because AIDS was associated with homosexuality, and there was a lot of homophobia in the Haitian community. And so there were times when you might have expected more, but there wasn't as much outrage, simply because of the stigma of homosexuality, as far as I can tell, again, in the historical record.
Excellent. That was a very insightful answer. We have a question from Tina Shull. This is powerful. Thank you. I was struck by your statement, quote, "That is why communities have always made their own media to tell their own stories from their own perspectives." Can you tell us a little more about this and the role of lasting impact of AIDS, HIV/AIDS community public memory projects? So they're asking about public memory and authoring your own narrative.
Yeah, this is an important question. I love that you picked up on that just little moment, because that chapter is actually about AIDS activist media and how they were treating the Haitian connection differently than mainstream media and trying to intervene. And one of the things that's really important, I think, about AIDS history in the US was their drive to document. Part of the reason why so much of AIDS, I think, that we know now has to do with gay communities vis-a-vis others is because AIDS activists documented absolutely everything. There's incredible archives, and they knew this was vitally important because they knew otherwise it would get lost or it would get misconstrued. And so absolutely, we still have these rich resources, and then people have created new archives too. So the ACT UP Oral History Project is one of those, which has nearly 200 interviews with former ACT UP New York activists, and that became the basis for Sarah Schulman's latest book, Let the Record Show, which is about the history of ACT UP New York. It's also, though, a handbook for activists today, and I have to say it's a vital resource. Yeah, there's lots of little pockets of this kind of archival material all over the US, and frankly, I think all over North America.
Great. So people please use the chat box, the Q&A box, and I think there might be, Adriana, did you say you wanted to add a comment here as well? Okay, so we'll wait for a second to see. We have about 3 or 4 minutes before the conclusion of the hour, and you mentioned some very interesting literature, Professor Chavez, about other books that covered this topic. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about other things we could read or resources that we could use to learn about this.
Yeah, so the book I mentioned is Naomi Pake's book called Rightlessness. And in that book, she has one chapter that is all about the Haitian imprisonment. It's a tremendous resource that really uses the situation to talk about the state of literally having no rights. And that's exactly what it was. To me, that's one of the more definitive histories of this particular situation. There's other folks like Neil Ahuja. Ahuja spelled Ahuja, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but his book, it also discusses this, and I think is excellent. Increasingly, there's more being written, and it's wonderful to see. So would be happy to give people more resources too if they wanted to send me an email.
Great. And one of the really wonderful things about modern technology is that when we put these videos on YouTube for the public to enjoy, we can put a comment and we can list the readings that you had that you just mentioned. So we just have a few moments left, Professor Chavez. Maybe you could kind of give us a great goodbye statement or a summary statement that kind of brings us to the conclusion of your talk.
Sure. I guess I would say I'm taking kind of several risks in this book, in that I'm really invested in us trying to make linkages that don't necessarily seem obvious in order for us to get to our shared objectives, particularly around abolition. And so I guess I just want to encourage all of us to be doing that in our visioning work, trying to build connections that don't seem obvious. And I think that's part of the toolbox that's going to get us where we want to go.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for taking time from your ultra busy schedule. I know that as an administrator, as a chair, that doesn't give you a lot of spare time. Also, I can say I learned a lot, and I'm sure that everybody else learned a lot from your talk. And thank you for everybody who submitted a question, who's attending. So maybe a virtual round of applause for Professor Chavez. So thank you very much. And then we're going to take a break for 15 minutes. So that's 15 minutes. And we'll have our final panel for the day called Academics Against Borders, Analyzing, Critiquing Borders. And that's a great way to wrap the day up. So thank you, everybody. I hope to see you in a few minutes. Thank you.